as you see on that slide is I have written quite some books, and some of them you might know already. So for example, the first book on scaling Agile actually was published way back in 2004. Anyway, I don't want to waste your time too much with all of this, because what I really want to talk about today is, as Martin said already, the Bossa Nova. And Bossa Nova is also the latest book that I wrote or co-wrote together with John Buck. Actually, if you have questions, that's also a great topic, how to pair write a book. However, that's not the topic today. So I want to look at how you probe your organization, how to implement a learning organization with Bossa Nova. For doing that, I first would like to hear from you. What do you think, from your perspective, are the biggest challenges for companies today? And for that, you need to go to menti.com and enter the code 5331181. And yeah, then you can type in text what you see as biggest challenges. So it can be a word, or it can also be 2 words, but make it brief at best. And maybe I type in the code in the chat again, and it was menti.com where you should go. And I hope this is working. And yeah, curious to see what you think. What are the challenges the companies are facing today or in this period of time? So it could be related to the pandemic, but it could be also just in general what you see is really difficult. Adapting to change is what I see. At least it works. Now we know that. Adapting to the pandemic, bureaucracy, lack of trust, coping with changes, external changes. There's a lot of change here. That's what I see. Work culture, innovation, agile leadership, also interesting. Remote collaboration. That was the question about the virtual thing. Priorities, distributed teams relates to the remote work. I leave it up a little bit more. Compliance is what I see. It seems everyone comes up with something else. That's interesting. So nothing stands out except for when you read it, then everything around change seems to be big. Because it has been said in different ways. Missing goals. Maybe this is also difficult in terms of all the changes that are going on. Okay, I leave you with that. And by the way, you will also get the slides, which will include also your Menti results. In case you still want to add something, you can still do that. So actually, what you just described, what are the biggest challenges, is what I believe can be summarized in just like kind of fears, inertia. So as in one word, which is VUCA. So what we see at the moment is that the world is volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, which is shortened to VUCA. And actually that was already the case before the pandemic. However, the pandemic really showed us what that exactly means, and that we really struggle through that, because just take a look at one thing, like budgets and Lechtele, I'm not sure if I pronounced your name correct. You mentioned already that you have looked into beyond budgeting, and this is kind of one of the things. If you think about budgets, the companies have created their budgets by the end of 2019, and at latest in March 2020, they all realized all the time they spent coming up with that budget was a waste of time. So there's just no way anymore for long-term plans and to, well, you also mentioned like missing goals or all this fear and uncertainty. And the pandemic just showed us even to a more extreme than we have seen it before already. So it's not a new thing, but the pandemic just put it to an extreme. What does this mean for companies? Actually, it asked companies to be agile. And now, not that you think what I mean with that is, well, that it means we need to implement Scrum all over the place and, I don't know, ask the board of directors to run their meetings as a Scrum team and coming up with a backlog and a Scrum master and whatever. That might help that board of directors meeting to be a little bit better or more efficient, but it doesn't help the company to be really agile. So what I mean with that, the VUCA role is really asking for agility, or for agile companies is agile in the literal sense, meaning that the companies need to be adaptive, responsive, fast, also nimble, and all of that together. So as a company, and not only in one part of it, but the whole company needs to be that. And this is what I mean with like an agile organization or an agile company. What comes with that agility, and this is kind of the subtitle of this talk, is that the company needs to keep learning. If it stops learning, it cannot deal really with this VUCA world. Now, looking at it perhaps a little bit closer, what does agile companies mean if it doesn't mean Scrum all over the place? Well, it means to look at the company from different angles. And the kind of the 4 areas that we discovered, so again, John, Buck, and I, were these 4 that you are seeing. I mentioned already beyond budgeting, like coming up with a long-term budget a year in advance isn't really helpful in a time where things are unstable and changing all the time. And that's the B that it stands for from the Bossa Nova. Then the OS stands for open space. And open space, actually, I can imagine that some of you know open space as a facilitation technique. And what we mean with open space here is taking the principles of the facilitation technique and apply them to the whole company. One example, what this could mean is that what you do right now very often is you come up with a job description and look for someone who fits that job description. And then you kind of put the person in the box to fulfill that job description. Now, what we need nowadays is to really leverage the full potential of every individual and also let people explore what else is possible. That means as well, like people can suggest any kind of features or ideas on new products. And if there are enough people who think this is a good idea, then this is a go. So this is kind of applying principles of open space on the company level. And that's the OS of the Bossa Nova. Then the S is Sociocracy, that looks more on how are we coming up with decisions and how is the power distributed or not in the company. And to make this kind of short, if decision-making and the power is centralized, we are just too slow for the VUCA world. Therefore, we need to do something different, which means like having more distributed way of coming up with decision making, and also having a hierarchy that allows to hear all voices and distributes the power. And then there's A for agile, and I guess most of you know most of it. So it's kind of, let's say, the inspect and adapt is the most important thing here we are looking at. Now that's the agile part. Now looking at the learning organization part, and sorry, you have to bear with me here because we go way back. Peter Senge in the 90s, and actually I think he started talking about that already in the 70s. So this is not a new thing, which doesn't mean it's not current or recent anymore. So he said, like, learning organizations are organizations that encourage adaptive and generative learning, encourage their employees to think outside the box, and to work in conjunction with other employees to find the best answer to any problem. And this is still true, and it's still something that's needed, and it is one answer next to being agile as a company to the VUCA world. Now, I would like to share 2 examples. What does this mean if companies are working in that way, if they have implemented Agile company-wide? Let's start with this one example. Probably all or most of you have seen something like that. So it's an expense sheet that you see here. And expense sheets are used like if you have been traveling, which we are not doing so much right now anymore, but also if you have maybe bought a new camera for your work from home office or whatever else kind of things you need in order to get your work done. And the problem with what's attached to that report is actually all the principles, rules, regulations that come with what we will get reimbursed for. So very often companies have a lot of regulations and rules, like what you are allowed to pay and how much money you can spend. And if I think on traveling, what kind of hotel you are allowed to book and all of that. And what these regulations are actually doing, they tell you, well, we as a company, we trust you that you will successfully run and being responsible for this multi-million-dollar euro project, but we don't trust you to buy a decent camera or book a decent hotel. So it's a sign of mistrust. And I know from several companies who really took Agile by its heart, and again, in the way I defined it earlier, that they also came to that conclusion that it doesn't really fit having these regulations around expenses and then saying, well, we are Agile. Now, what do? There's like one company, it's a German one, IT Agile. Well, they have Agile already in the name, so you can imagine that this discussion really came up for them. And the way it came up for them was actually more for traveling. And they then decided that they'd try something out. And what they tried or probed was coming up with or having in place just 3 principles for all travel expenses. And the 3 principles were like, however you spend the money, it has to be legal. Well, that's hopefully true anyway. However, that's one of their principles. So you're not allowed to do anything that's not legal. That's good. Then the second thing is that the way you're spending the money or what kind of, how much something is able to cost, you have to spend it in a sensitive way. And nobody defined what that means. And the third thing is when you are traveling, so for them, it was traveling only. When you're traveling, you have to take care of yourself. And also that hasn't been defined what it is. When after they started probing into that, I talked to the CEO of the company and I asked, how is it going? And he said, well, you know, it's pretty good. What they found out is that about 1/3 of the people are traveling first class on trains and 2/3 second class. And again, this is Germany. We only have 2 classes, and that should be MARC and ICE, what you are seeing there on that image, which is also one that they are using for motivating that thing. And then before I could even start asking, he said, well, and not what you think, Jutta. It's not that like me, the CEO, and the other top managers are traveling first class. It's actually the consultants traveling first class. And at first I thought like, not sure is this a good or bad thing. And he right away said, well, and this is very well accepted by everyone because taking care of yourself means something different for people who are on the road all the time compared to people who are not traveling that much. And I know we are in the pandemic, and at least I'm not traveling at the moment at all. So this example might not be something that applies to you right now. However, what this really says, with also his explanation, was that, well, treating everyone the same doesn't mean people are treated equal. And with regulations that are true for everyone in a company, you try exactly to do that. You treat everyone the same, but that's not equal for everyone. Like that thing, the consultants are more on the road than like other people. However, this is just one example. I quickly want to show you two others. So there is Miles, that's a Norwegian company, and they just decided to have only one principle. And it means whenever you spend money, it's not limited to travel only. You have to put it on the intranet, what you spend it for and how much it was. So basically what's happening there is peer control or self-control, because if you put there something, if I buy a, I don't know, 1,000 euro camera for my work from home office, then probably people will question me why, if that was really needed or not. And maybe I find a good explanation why I really need that. And maybe not, maybe it wasn't a good idea. Then there is Roche from Switzerland, and they have also changed everything around travel budgets. Actually, they have given up on travel budgets altogether and are now really full open and transparent and just rely on self-control and self-management. The interesting thing, what they found out, that actually less money is spent on travel. So not due to the pandemic, just because that's a while back when they started doing that. So it's also, if you trust people more, maybe it's also more beneficial for the company. Another example, what I'm having is about salary increase and salaries in general. And this is an example also from a German company, Mayflower, who said like, well, the way salaries and salary increases are decided on doesn't sound very agile, because it was done in the hidden and like just managers decided on it and nobody knew anything. So what they did was actually a few people who found that not a good idea, the way it's working. They just got together and met several times and discussed that. And the first thing that they decided upon was, well, we make our salaries transparent. And so they did, but at first only among themselves. So just a small group. However, then this had a good effect. So that's what they kind of saw. And so they started discussing about that more, and they decided to make it open to the whole company. Doing this at first also created some discussion, but then more and more people did that. And so the salary went open. So as you can see, this is nothing that has been decided from the top. So it has been done from the bottom, and it just kind of emerged. And what they are doing right now is, and well, that's not completely true. I just heard they have now, they're in a whatever next or over next revision of how they are doing it. So the way that I know they are doing it is that they have one person who is a representative for salary discussions, and therefore that person is on all the discussions. Then there is the person under discussion brings in like two people who the person wants feedback from. And then there's the direct manager, the branch manager here. And they discuss together on, well, how did the person under discussion help or contribute to the company's goals? So it might mean, and the goals are obvious, so people know about them. So it might be something, I know they have a lot around learning, that what did the person learn over whatever period of time, and how did the person help others to learn, and how did the person create a learning environment? And people are discussing about that, and then each one individual comes up with an idea like what should be the increase for that person. And they do this in like individually in silence, kind of like a planning poker, and then show it all together and they start discussing again, and then they come up with an agreement. And after all the discussions for every person have been done, they look at, okay, how does what has been decided or recommended fit to what's available? And then they do the math to make that appropriate for everyone. So this is what they are doing. So these were like two examples, different examples. Well, both in a way have to do with money, but this is by accident. I haven't thought about that. The thing I want to get to is, what are the values that are really supporting these examples? And the values are, maybe they sound familiar, at least for the Agile people. They're on the one hand, transparency. The things are made transparent, like with the salary, but also with the travel budget, the expense reports, whatever. So it's just obvious for everyone. Then it's based on self-organization. So it's not like, okay, this is how we do it, but it's kind of emerging. And then it has to do with continuous learning, because things are changing and people are kind of setting it up in the way and getting feedback, and then ensure that it's working for them. And I have to admit, those two examples are not too much focused on the customer, but only because I didn't really mention it. For example, for the goals of the salary increase, of course, the customer focus plays a really important role. Now, those values, they are also defined in a maybe more coherent way, and I give you a little bit of time to read through them. Often people are a bit surprised about transparency, because transparency is sometimes discussed that everything needs to be transparent for everyone. However, that's not really what's meant. And only if I think of myself, information overload is really something I'm struggling with. And the thing for transparency is, I need to be able to get all the information I need to get my job done. And I'm also in the responsibility to provide all the information other people need for getting their job done. So it's not powered by information hiding, right? So that's more the point here. Okay, now I have another question quickly, which is, if we now know some examples, we have the values. Now the question is probably, where do you start? Not sure if you're aware that companies are actually marked by or characterized by three things: their strategy, their structure, and the processes. And so the question, if you want to start in your company to implement some stuff that makes the company more agile, the question is, where do you start? Is structure going first and the other things are following? Or is strategy the thing you have to start and the others are following? Or is it processes that you need to start with and the others are following? So again, I would like you to go to Menti and answer what you think is happening. So the first one would be, do I see this here? I'm not sure. Well, you see my mouse here. So is it the process going first and structure follows and then strategy follows? Or is it the strategy going first and then process and structure follows? Or is it structure going first and we have like none of the above? And there could be also, maybe it's all of the above. So waiting a little bit, what do you think? Kind of balanced right now, except for nobody thinks structure goes first. That's interesting. Let's keep waiting a little bit. Maybe, I'm missing culture as an option here. That's a really good point, and I want to come back to that right away. So, and I understand culture should go first and then the other thing follows after. Is there anything standing out? It seems not. Well, maybe now. No, kind of. Okay, it seems, well, it's not really super clear, but 38% at the moment say somewhat all of the above. And actually, this is really what research has found. So there was a time where people thought strategy has always to go first and it defines everything else. And then there's that other thing where it says, well, structure is actually that's going first and everything else is following. So you could search for strategy follows structure, or you can search for structure follows strategy. There's a lot of research out there. However, for either way, however, nowadays people say, well, they are all interdependent, and therefore it doesn't really matter where you are starting. And what you also see inside here is what I meant, that these three things are really characterizing a company. Right, I see culture eats strategy for breakfast. Again, I'm coming back to culture right away. So strategy is kind of showing the purpose of the organization, and therefore we say like it's an organization, versus structure is more like it has an organization and the process is how the company is organized. Now, culture is an interesting thing, and I understand that people think it's missing. So the way we are looking at it is that culture is really something that's in the middle, and it's emerging from the practices and behaviors you are showing or implementing for your strategy, structure, process. So practice and behaviors are actually things that let a culture emerge. There is no way of starting with changing a culture. Culture is something that is a follow-up thing. Okay, so now we know it doesn't really matter where we start. That's a good thing. So we can start with strategies, process, structure, whatever. Now the other question is, how can we start doing something like what we have seen from Miles or Roche or IT Agile or Mayflower? I'm not saying that whatever they are doing, that everything is fine. However, they just started in that direction, which is great. So how do you actually get started? It is, well, as a good citizen, you start reflecting on your situation. What's the situation you are in? Then you start, and for the moment, maybe I say, instead of probe, experiment. You come up with an experiment. Later on, I will define the difference to a probe. Try that, and then you reflect again on your situation and how it has changed. What we really think is important is that you also publish about your learnings from going through that experiment. Because, for example, if ITHI would have never told us that they're using now these three principles, I wouldn't be able to share that with you. So you really need to ensure, I think we all should do a much better job in sharing our learnings also in terms of organizational development. Now to the probes. Remember that thing, yeah, for example, that IT Agile did. So the travel expenses, or Myers was only expenses, or Roche was also travel expenses. So the situation and what happened with that. So we have a probe for that. And what we call that is trust cheaper. The thing is, very often, and we have this background definition here, very often traditional travel expenses are burdensome and assume people can't be trusted. That was also kind of how I talked about this earlier. Then we come up with a hypothesis that maybe all those regulations and procedures and reports that we have in place for all those travel expenses or expenses in general, they actually cost more than they save without demoralizing. And actually the cost more than they save, the interesting thing is Roche is really the company, the first company I know of who has really proven that this is true. And then for an experiment, first of all, you should measure, is the situation really the way you think it is? So are people really frustrated about that, demoralized, whatever? Then you come up with an experiment, and the experiment could be the thing that IT Agile does, or maybe you want to come up with that experiment that Miles does. It's only this one principle, or something completely different. You try it for a given time box, at best only with a few parts of the company, and then you post survey and audit it, and if it works well, you roll it out to the rest of the company or to a broader part of the company. So this, what you see here, is an abbreviated probe, and it is an experiment, yes, but it is actually more than an experiment. So it has a context, which is the background. It has a hypothesis for that experiment. What do we believe is actually happening here, and what do we believe will happen if we try this and that? And then you have the experiment, for which you also come up with some metrics, how you can measure it, that you can validate or invalidate your hypothesis. Now, if this sounds all a little bit big, especially like the salary increase discussions, and also the kind of what do we do with the travel budget, I have maybe a simpler example here. And that simpler example comes from a bank. And it was the board of directors. And actually, this picture is no real picture. I found it somewhere. And I just imagined that a bank should, the board of directors from a bank should really meet in a room like that. And probably their room is way more modern. Anyway, so the board of directors of that bank, they realized that the way they communicate and how they work in their board of directors meetings isn't really that good. And then they came up with the hypothesis, what if we are removing that table? Would this help us to communicate better with each other and getting more effective in what we are doing? And so then tried it. So they removed the table, and guess what? Exactly what they thought would happen did happen, plus a little bit more. So it wasn't only that the communication really was more open and honest, but also it was more transparent to the people who are not in that room, so to the rest of the company. So also the communication flow to the rest of the company improved really a lot. And now, why do I bring this example? Not because I think all of you are sitting in board of directors meetings, but because this is actually a very small change that they did. They just removed the table from the room. It's not a big thing. It's not as big as like the process from Mayflowers of the salary increase or anything like that. It's really more, well, okay, let's try that and put the table outside and see what's happening. And the thing is, for a probe, for a probe to make a difference, the thing doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be huge. It can be a really small step that can make a huge difference. So a learning organization actually is a group of people who are continually enhancing their capabilities to create what they want to create. And I hope that this is something that you kind of got from, well, how Bossa Nova is really helping you to implement that. I know we could have also been diving more deeper into how beyond budgeting works, or Sociocracy and open space and whatever, and I'm happy to do that if you are interested in that. But this is what I wanted to bring to you today, offer you today. So how does Bossa Nova help you to implement a learning organization? And for closing that, I have another Menti question for you, which is, what's the most important or surprising concept that you learned today? And it's still the Menticom, and you have the 4331181 is still the code, and it's like the first thing. You just type in a word or two, and I'm interested to hear that. Let's see. Cannot change culture. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I think you can change culture, but not by working on culture, but by working on practices, behaviors in terms of strategy, structure, processes. But there's no way of starting a workshop and saying, okay, let's change the culture, and people do that, I know. Then they come up with nice values and slogans, and it's put all over the place, and a few years later they do the same thing because nothing is changing. And the thing is, culture changes with changed behavior, and that's the key thing. What else do we see here? Small probes, and it can't be small enough. I want to stress that. Unregulated reimbursing, that this is really happening. And even, well, you might not have heard of IT Agile or Miles, which are both smaller software companies, but Roche is a pharmaceutical, really huge corporation, and even they do it. And we have change to probe, moving the table. Yeah, that really often makes a difference. Trust is important. Maybe a little bit, but we are also then going soon to the questions. And I think you can create a worse culture pretty easy, yet creating on purpose a better culture, that is indeed impossible. Okay, yeah, well, getting worse, but it's again the thing, it's different behaviors that are taking place or are becoming commonplace, and because they are accepted, or they might be even motivated. So sometimes you can also think of how are careers made in the company, and often what's helping you to make a career is something that's not definitely good for the culture. And so still it is on the culture. Oh, I see the BOSSA stands out here, and actually the NOVA, I didn't speak about that. We just thought we haven't eaten up the truth and know everything. We know there is way more out there, and we hope that everyone explores what else is out there. We just saw that the 4 things beyond budgeting, open space, sociocracy, and Agile, they are really looking at completely different angles from Agile organization, and therefore are complementing each other. So I assume that this is kind of what we are seeing from people here. And before I take the next question comment, just for you to know where you find me, and Yalma, you might show that to Katja. She is in every talk of mine, because, well, she has created like the illustrations and so on. So that's the one aware. Right, so this is how you reach out to me. So the question or comment from Julia was, I believe this is why introducing Agile fails, because culture is disregarded as something that can be fixed later. Without mindset change, 93% of transformation fails. Yes, and again, also mindset, it is a thing. It's kind of like culture. You cannot change a mindset, and I almost assume that this is clear, maybe not, but you cannot, well, I cannot say to Martin, now change your mind or whatever. That won't happen. It just happens by doing things in a different way, and the way you are doing it is then becoming your second nature. And therefore, it's a behavior that you see and it's shown in the company. And this will change both kind of your attitude, mindset, culture. So I'm glad about this question, because it gives me maybe a better possibility to talk about that. The thing is, to be very honest, very often we are not doing a good job in explaining what we really mean with open space in parts of Bossa Nova. And maybe first I start with the boring sessions here. So open space, as it's known as a facilitation technique, which I don't think it's boring, by the way, is inviting everyone to come up with topics they think like need to be discussed or resolved or anything like that. So it comes without an agenda. And people who are there are the right people coming up with whatever they think needs to be discussed. And this is already one of the key principles for open space for a company or organizational open space. And we see that with, for example, WL Gore, the Gore-Tex company. So they are doing it this way, that everyone is invited at all times to suggest a new feature, a new product. And if there are enough people who think, well, this is great, I'm really passionate about that, I want to work on that new feature, new product, then it's a go. And so in that sense, open space in Bossa Nova doesn't really have, well, it's not the facilitation. And you can use open space as a facilitation technique together with Bossa Nova. It's no hindrance, but this is not what we mean. It's more the principles, that maybe the attitude that's known in open space, that it's used on the organizational level. What I'm hearing is that you're using self-selecting teams, right, for working on something, which is excellent, which is really one way of using open space really in that way. And it seems to me that it's that the alignment is kind of missing there, which should ensure that people take the responsibility for what we as a company really want to accomplish. You know, if the overall purpose is clear, then at least I haven't seen that. I have seen that at the start, self-selecting teams, like first where people kind of signed up that this wasn't right, but then they started talking to each other and balanced it and said, well, I see you're on that team, but there is already somebody with that skill, but that other team is really missing. So they started really kind of negotiating with each other. That's what, at least my experience, what I have seen. However, what's really needed for that is that alignment. And that's probably something you hear more often, that there is no autonomy without alignment, at least no effective one. That's the really big one, is the purpose of the company. What is this? Why are we there? If you go a little bit smaller, then think of those 4 values, like the customer focus. If we are not believing in that, well, then it's very likely that nobody really wants to work on X, Y, Z, because we don't care about the customer. And then maybe another idea could be, and I don't know, this is really from far away, perhaps the way the teams were decided upon, like what's the focus of every team, maybe you can work on that, and maybe that's not a good idea. You know, how you set it up in the first place. Speaking of maintenance only, because why isn't the team that's creating the stuff not also maintaining it? But again, it's from far away, and maybe the situation is different than what I'm hearing. But just to give you, yeah, some ideas here. That's a super interesting point. I'm completely with you. Actually, I know that in Agile often we say we really need fixed and stable teams. And so because of the Tuckman, yeah, storming, norming, performing, and so on. First of all, it's not so clear that Tuckman was really right. So, and he also put it at stake and said like, well, more people need to provide evidence that it's really that way and so on. And so this is still a little bit on discussion. Well, it has been seen, but it also has not been seen. And so it might be true or not. The one thing that I see is if you are having stable teams over a long time, what you're actually ending up with is a team that's most often not super innovative because they keep doing the same thing again and again. I kind of feel, for me, it's kind of a belonging, reinforcing thing. Sometimes it seems like an old couple where everyone, well, the one knows already what the other one wants to say, and so there's no need to speak anymore or so. It might be extreme, but still the thing is, being stable over a really long period of time isn't so helpful, I think. And so you need to have some change. And however, that's the consultant thing, it depends. And it depends on what's the situation for the product you are working on right now. Because if, for example, if you really need to be innovative at that moment, then a stable team might not be the best thing. But if that's not your problem right now, then maybe you're good off with a stable team. Or maybe if you have a lot of changes going on right now around the team, maybe it's good for them that at least that part is stable right now. That's kind of the, it depends. It's yeah, I'm sorry for that, but it's just what it is. Context matters. And I agree. That's also what I see, that it's seldom that a team is really completely stable, even if you want to keep it stable, because there's always some fluctuation or sickness or whatever it is. So it's just not that way. Exactly the point. If a team is really stable over a long time, even if it started as a diverse team, it's not diverse anymore. And that's the kind of the consequence, that it then is also not innovative anymore, because it just has this one perspective and not anymore the diverse perspectives. Yeah, great point. Mm-hmm. That's true. Actually, I've never heard that. I hear it the other way around, that the company fears that it will be abused, and because they kind of give a promise also that, well, we trust you, and therefore they have to show the trust as well. And the thing is, probably it will be abused. However, also the rules and regulations that are in place are abused. You know, it's kind of, it's still cheaper to trust everyone and then have those few who are abusing it than right away say, I don't trust anyone here. And Bjarte Wognes always says that it's like you put everyone in jail right away, because that's what you believe of everyone. And it's just, well, starting with, well, what Julia said about culture and so on. This is practices we are showing. These are behaviors we are showing, right? If we don't trust people and we show it this way, like in the expense reports or these regulations, that's a thing that makes a difference. And maybe there's a really nice other example that I once ran across long ago. Also a software company, I think like one of the biggest ones in Germany, not the one with the 3-letter, not SAP, but also like 3,000 people also that they're having, so also smaller than SAP. And what they did long ago, as I said, what they did for lunch, so they provided food, and the food people had to pay for, but there was no one at the cashier. So people just paid at the open cashier, but there was no person or anyone controlling it, and they just put the money in and took their exchange out. And that was probably, I saw that 15 years ago already. And when I saw that, I said, well, this is so amazing, because what signal do you send here to your people? we trust you. And that's really deep. And also here they said, well, at some days it doesn't work out, and other days it does. Sometimes they have more money in and sometimes less, so it's whatever. But yeah, it makes a difference. Thank you for having me. Yeah, bye.